Tuatahiaki e mihi ana ki a koutou, ko whakarau ka mai i tēnei ata. Te whakarongo ki o mātou nei mahi ui o mātou mahi rangahau hoki. He uri tēnei no te tai tokirau, te kuake au ki whāngarei. I hunuku mai au ki Waikato ki te whai aku tohu. No reira, e tikana me mihi ki ngā hunga no konei, koutou e pupuri ana i te mauri, i te mana whenua o enei whenua o enei moana hoki. Good morning everybody, my name is Erana Walker and I'm a PhD student at the University of Waikato. And I'm here today to share some of my research findings about Kaitiakitanga in urban spaces. I grew up in a place called Whangarei, which is very far from here, and left Whangarei to chase my first degree at the University of Waikato, and haven't left Hamilton yet, but there's potential to go home in the near future. And I'm part of the People, Cities and Nature program and part of the Māori Values team. But before I move into my research findings, I wanted to make a plug for my one of the articles that we've just submitted to the New Zealand Journal of Ecology, which we were part of a special issue on mātauranga Māori and ecology. So if you are interested, I would recommend having a look at some of the articles that have been written by different research groups. And our paper talks about Kaitiakitanga and urban restoration and how it could potentially support urban restoration and relationships with Māori communities. So if you have time, have a read of it, and you can come to your own conclusions. And what I like to do with my presentations is start with kind of my why I'm doing this research. And this is a picture of home for me. This is Whangarei, standing atop Parihaka. And I use this image because it gives the audience an idea of where I grew up. So I grew up in this very, it's a mixture of urban but also has easy access to nature, similar to Nelson. And so this area is significant to me because you see nature, you see the urban space, but what I see is different areas that are important to our narratives, our hapu narratives, our whānau narratives. So in this image, there are past sites here, there are significant mountains and rivers. You have the Whangarei Harbour, which is named after one of our ancestors, Reipai, who came from the Waikato, and then you also have the Hātio River. And then again, Parihaka is another significant area. And why this is important is because this place has actually informed how I see Kaitiakitanga and how I practice Kaitiakitanga. So for me, living in this place where I have strong connections to whānau, strong connections to hapu, I've learned Kaitiakitanga through that lens. And so all my practices, my understandings are informed by this place. And so that conjures up the question, what happens to a young Māori girl who grows up in Whangarei and moves to another tribal area? How do I practice Kaitiakitanga in those spaces? And how do I connect to nature when those are not my original tribal boundaries? And so for myself, I've kind of collated Kaitiakitanga into 5 areas to understand it a bit more. And the first one is place. So I've talked about that. Whangarei is the place where I've grown up. It informs my practices. So when understanding Kaitiakitanga, we have to look at the context. What are the stories of the area? How can those inform how people practice Kaitiakitanga? The next part is whakapapa, so your genealogical links to the place that informs your Kaitiakitanga practice. So for me, we have strong links to Whangarei. Our ancestors are from there. My whānau or my family have grown up in that area, so we know different sites of significance. And so that responsibility and obligation to those ancestors also informs how I practice Kaitiakitanga. The next one is intergenerational knowledge. So when we're practicing Kaitiakitanga, we're thinking about how can we transfer this knowledge onto the next generation. What information do we need to keep so that the next generation can carry on into the future? And so intergenerational knowledge is a broad range. of knowledges. So we're talking about knowledges about lands, about waters, about tupuna, about relationships to other hapu. And so the genealogical links to those different tribes also informs practices of kaitiakitanga. The fourth one is spirituality, so it's not really talked about in the science community, and I don't really want to go into the reasons why, but that's an important part of kaitiakitanga. So we're talking about things such as mauri, wairua, spiritual aspects in the Māori culture that actually inform the responsibility and obligation of kaitiakitanga. And then the last one is resource use and engagement. So when I'm talking about engagement, it's talking about actually engaging with the resource itself. So having access to go out and practice cultural practices and maintaining that relationship with a resource through your cultural practice is part of my understanding of kaitiakitanga. And so these questions, these experiences of moving from a semi-urban area to a very urban space such as Hamilton, then it's not a new experience. I know for a lot of Māori who have moved from those rural areas into urban spaces, they are experiencing the same kind of issues and challenges that I face living in Hamilton. But this has informed my own research, which is looking at how do you practice kaitiakitanga in urban spaces, what does it look like and what are the challenges. So we're looking at it through three different research methods, so the survey, focus groups and interviews, and we're trying to understand how it's different for different Māori groups. So there's this perception that when you're in an urban space and you're Māori, you're an urban Māori person. But actually if you break it down, you have different relationships to urban space when you're Māori. So you have mana whenua, so those are your local hapu, local iwi who are actually from that urban space. And then you have people like me who are mātāwaka. So we're Māori, but we're not actually from that urban space. But we have cultural practices that we're trying to understand how we can practice in those new tribal spaces. And then how these ideas of kaitiakitanga can actually inform or are challenged by restoration or supported by restoration. And so, to give you a bit more context, globally 50% of the world's population live in urban spaces. For Māori, over 80% of Māori live in urban spaces today. And there's a potential in living in those urban spaces that our access to nature is limited. And we know for wellbeing, and Bruce has touched on this a bit, is that actually nature informs wellbeing. Nature actually helps us to increase wellbeing, and for a lot of Māori that is a true statement. And I'll get into that in some of my data. But also reducing that access to nature poses risks to both physical and mental wellbeing and spiritual wellbeing as well. And for in a Māori context as well, nature actually informs our identity. So a lot of our narratives, a lot of our storytelling includes this idea of nature. So when we don't have access to those natural landscapes or that nature aspect, we're actually limiting as well some of our understandings of self and identity. And so today I will be sharing with you some findings from my survey focus groups and interviews. The interviews are fresh off the press, just for Nelson, so you'll be one of the first groups to hear what our interview participants have to say. And so for the survey we wanted to understand what people were actually thinking about kaitiakitanga. And so the first one is that it's a philosophy. So often we just see kaitiakitanga as just a practice, but for some of our participants it was actually a philosophy. It entailed principles, values, etc. And that informed how they would undertake it in their own spaces. And then the next quote over here, the participants are actually talking about not only protecting nature, but also protecting people. So again, kaitiakitanga, we usually associate that with just the environment, but actually the concept itself entails looking after people as well. And these are some of the key words that people use in terms of kaitiakitanga. So guardianship was a big one, but we also talk about responsibility, care, whānau, whenua, when we discuss discuss this idea of kaitiakitanga. And then where did they practice? So we wanted to understand where people were actually going to practice kaitiakitanga. And so the first one was most of them actually practiced it in their homes. We're thinking that the reason for this high percentage in practicing at home was that it was safer, especially if you are from a different tribal group. It's safer to practice at home rather than going out and practicing it in a place that you're not supposed to be in. The next one was marae, again another safe space to undertake kaitiakitanga, and then a limited use of nearby parks to practice their understandings. And then when we get a bit more into how they're practicing, we asked the participants what types of resources they were using and what they were using those resources for. So a high percentage, again, we're using the plants for medicinal purposes. So those plants are kawakawa, koromiko, kumarahau, etc. And so when we delved a bit further into how were you accessing them, some of our participants were having those resources brought into the urban space because they weren't aware of spaces in urban areas that they could freely access those medicinal resources. And then we asked them, how long do you spend? What's the time frame for practicing kaitiakitanga? And it was either you didn't practice it or you had to commit 100%. There's really no in between. We tried to put a time period, but most of our participants said that if you commit to practicing kaitiakitanga, then that's it. You're in the group. There's no going back. And then the next part was how people were learning about kaitiakitanga. And so you'll see here for this part of the chart, it was passed down from someone else. Someone else was teaching our participants. They learnt through observation and then learnt through practice as well, so practicing alongside somebody. And then a lot of them used other materials such as books to learn about kaitiakitanga as well. And then the next question we asked was what actually supports your practice? What parts of nature or non-nature areas support your practice of kaitiakitanga? And for a lot of our participants, it was a marae or nature aspect. So we've got the oceans and then rivers. So if it wasn't related to culture or to nature, it wasn't really useful in practicing kaitiakitanga. And then the barriers to practicing kaitiakitanga. So again, this is our survey participants, was limited knowledge. So there was no, so if we just go back here, you can see that a lot of our participants learnt from other people. So if they didn't have access to those people, they had no knowledge about what they could or couldn't do or the places that they could or couldn't go to. And then an interesting one down here is laws and policies. Actually were a barrier to practicing kaitiakitanga. So when we delved a bit further into that, the participants were talking about local council regulations on their properties, what they could and couldn't do on their properties. And then again, some people highlight that their neighbours were barriers to practicing kaitiakitanga. And then when we move, so we're moving into the focus groups now, so we asked them again, what do you know about kaitiakitanga? So moving a bit deeper into their understanding. And so up here, again, the idea of spiritual and cultural perspectives, intergenerational responsibilities and connections to nature through a Māori lens, so connection to Ranginui and Papatuanuku. And then some of them talked about not actually practicing kaitiakitanga, but practicing general environmental practices such as recycling, picking up rubbish. So there was this idea that those actions weren't part of this idea of kaitiakitanga, they were just not add-on, but they were different forms of protecting the environment. And then the last one down here, making conscious ethical choices. And then again, this is from our second focus group. So our participants were talking about kaitiakitanga in relation to protecting the forest and the oceans. And then the other one was talking about the need to ensure their practices could be transferred to their grandchildren or their own children. And so using the resources that were available to them in these spaces. And then the actual practice itself, they were talking about food gardens, connecting spiritually to places, but actually running workshops to teach about Kaitiakitanga practices, picking up rubbish, again, that spiritual connection, and then cultural monitoring for local hapu as well in the Hamilton area. And then the next one, which I think was interesting, was actually letting nature be nature, which is what this participant was talking about, not trying to force nature to do what you want it to do. So our participant talks about not putting any poisons or pesticides on their whenua or their land so that the land can actually operate on it. So, and then our interview, participants talked about Kaitiakitanga being more than just a custodian. So you had other areas that you had to think about in terms of being a kaitiaki. So protecting resources, but being an active member of a kaitiaki group. So you again, going back to that idea of committing to Kaitiakitanga, once you're in it, there's no getting out. And then I think, and then down here, I think Kaitiakitanga traditionally is a genealogical, culturally, environmentally responsible to a bit of land. So all those aspects intertwined into what it means to be a kaitiaki. And then so when we asked the interview participants what they thought practicing Kaitiakitanga looked like for them, this quote here I thought was very interesting. So this participant discussed practicing a general form of Kaitiakitanga, so you're recycling, going zero waste, etc. But this participant made the statement that because they weren't from that urban space or from that local hapu, they didn't actually practice Kaitiakitanga because they didn't have the rights to. And so that's interesting because it does highlight that challenge that Māori are facing in that urban space, is they actually, no, we won't go out and fish or we won't go out and make these changes to landscapes because we're not from that area, and we actually have to seek approval from local hapu. And so this participant here also makes that that statement as well, is that when you're living in an urban space that you don't whakapapa too, you need to consider other things in terms of engaging with that urban space. The next question that we asked them was, what kind of engagement do you do in terms of urban restoration? So a lot of our participants said that they didn't engage with restoration projects. Some of them did highlight some, so like the Waiwhakareke, one in Hamilton City, gully restorations, as well as ones to do with Kohanga and Kura Kaupapa. But some of them said no, they don't involve themselves in restoration groups. But what was interesting is that they are keen to be involved. They want to be involved, they just don't know. In terms of, from a cultural perspective, how would they engage with those restoration groups, and then who would they talk to about being involved with those projects. So what is our data telling us? Kaitiakitanga is being practiced in urban spaces, but it's being practiced in the homes of our participants. So they're not yet comfortable to go out and explore where they can gather different resources from. And also Kaitiakitanga is a holistic practice, so it's not just about being out in nature, but trying to understand how nature can inform practices. Inform practices with nature and people. And then the next one is that it's been practiced by both mana whenua and mātā waka, and mātā waka are very aware of the challenges of practicing Kaitiakitanga in a new tribal area. And then the fourth part is the need to understand Māori needs and culture in terms of practicing Kaitiakitanga in urban spaces. So thinking about how that urban space can actually encourage those practices. And then the last two, supporting the retention of knowledge and the transmission of knowledge. And I think the biggest point is actually thinking about this restoration projects could support Kaitiakitanga. So we do know that there are resources that Māori communities need in urban spaces, and urban restoration could be the lead way to support that. So when we're thinking about restoration projects, what kind of plants do you think Māori practitioners could use or access in your restoration projects, especially for medicinal purposes? So those might be the plants that you actually include in your restoration plans. Who could you talk to help include local narratives in your restoration projects, so that Māori communities, when they access those restoration sites, they can see those narratives in the forms of pathways or plants or whatever, and so on. So that's the presentation. Yeah, thank you.